Mike along here with some good news. Have you ever thought about starting your own podcast? The answer to this question is really simple. Anchor. Anchor is a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing your podcast. Best of all, it's 100% free and ridiculously easy to use. So if you always wanted to start a podcast, go to anchor.fm/start. That's anchor.fm/start. I can't wait to hear your podcast.
Okay. I don't know if you can hear me.
All right. Yeah, so I think we're connected.
Okay.
All right. So it's February the 18th, I believe, 2021. Thank you for joining me. We have a special guest on, Brandon Lyon. He's the chairman of the Fulton County Libertarian Party, and he's a member of the Johnstown Water Board here in Johnstown, New York, Fulton County, and he's also, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's pretty much about it. So, Brandon, I guess we could talk about taxes, gun control, maybe abortion, since that's a controversial issue. Just so our viewers can have a better understanding of these type of issues. And so one thing I had in mind was the fair tax. And so explain to our viewers how that would work and how it would essentially replace the income tax and all that. And why is it a good alternative? Because I know, some people talk about the fair tax, and then there's others that specify, would eliminate the corporate income tax, and then with that, the left will claim that we won't make enough money for the government and this and that.
Sure. Like you said, the fair tax would be a replacement to the national income tax, not like a supplemental to it. And it's a consumption tax where a certain percentage is added on to everything that is bought, very similar to the VAT or value added tax that is in some European countries. The main difference is that every citizen would get what's called a prebate. So it's like a rebate, but in advance, of a certain amount of money, so that anyone at the poverty level, they would get back as much money as they would essentially be paying in this new consumption tax. So that's one way that this would be actually more progressive than the current income tax. Because if you actually spent below that money, you would actually come out ahead. You'd actually come out with more money than you put in. It would also simplify. Everything okay?
Right. Yeah, no, it's just family issues and all that. So I'm at my father's house. So carry on with what you were saying.
Sure. So it would simplify a lot of things, because right now the U.S. tax code is thousands of pages long, with all of the different deductions, earmarks, carve-outs for specific industries or specific occupations. So all of that would be gone, not just for individuals, but also for businesses. And that's a large chunk of some businesses, is just making sure that they try to pay as little amount of tax as possible. And so they're employing lots and lots of accountants. So one industry that probably would get hit is probably the accounting tax preparation industry. But it would simplify so many things. And it would really, one side benefit would be that it would show people exactly how much of their money is going to taxes. Because you mentioned the corporate income tax. So as everyone knows, businesses don't pay taxes. They just shift the taxes onto their customers. So similar to how sales tax works. But the thing is that people don't see how much of their money is going towards those taxes because it's folded into the price of whatever they're buying. So this way, this is the actual price of the item, and this is how much money I'm spending in taxes in addition to that. So I think it'll really show people exactly how much of their money goes to taxes, even if they think that, even if they don't pay any income tax, a large chunk of their money that they spend goes just towards taxes.
Because, like, you know, I hear some of the arguments, that come out, for and against the fair tax, and one such argument is that the only way it would work is that if you made cuts. Now, coming from a libertarian perspective, that would make a lot of sense because there's a lot of layers on the federal government, especially at the federal level, probably government agencies that we don't need. And then we see a lot of the micromanagement that gets carried over at the state level, and it just becomes a debacle. So, like I've often pointed out, like we should abolish every single federal government agency with the exception of Medicaid, Medicare, CHIP, Social Security, and those programs would still be funded through the fair tax, correct?
Well, you bring up a good point. There are a number of different agencies that deal with helping those less fortunate on a safety net. You mentioned Medicaid, CHIPS, which provides money for families with children for food. And even things like that could actually be rolled into the fair tax. So all you'd really have to do is increase the amount of the prebate that everyone gets, and that would actually help offset either getting rid of those programs or reducing them in somewhat, but still
in terms of how they're distributed.
Yeah, because I know in New York State, there are so many different agencies that try to help people in poverty, and that could be for housing assistance. It could be there's a different one for heating. There's a different one for food stamps, and there are so many of these agencies that could be streamlined.
Right, and into the fair tax. Now, the Social Security thing, right? Like many of these programs, I understand from the perspective of not only someone who's libertarian, but someone who might also have a disability, autism being one of them, whereby you have so many layers of dependencies just among people who truly need those services. And I've often pointed out as well that if we allow the free market to compete against those programs, but still retain those programs and roll it under the fair tax, and we could still make our cuts, that would work out better than having the income tax. And but there's still layers of government agencies that if we had to make cuts, we could abolish.
And actually, Larry Sharp brought up this idea when he was campaigning for governor, to actually allow people to, like whatever they pay in county property tax, to actually earmark that money for different nonprofits. So for example, I mean, no one would end up paying less money. It's just they would direct that money to certain nonprofits that help the community. One example that I can think of the top of my head is the addiction center that we have here in Fulton County that actually provides temporary housing for people that are trying to get clean. And I know a few people that work there, and I think they do some great work. I mean, obviously no Nothing's perfect, but that would be one thing that I would, if I had the option of earmarking some of my property taxes, either it could go there, it could go to Lexington, which is another nonprofit that we have here in Fulton County. And I know people that have worked there, and I know people that use the services, and that's another one that I think does valuable work.
Right. Because, and you mentioned Lexington, right? And, part of the issue with the way things are now, the state provides a good portion of the funding, but 2/3 of it goes on towards the administrators and so forth that are managing these type of agencies like Lexington, for example, but this is throughout the state. And there's also Vanderheiden and various others in the capital region that I can think of. And then there's other agencies throughout the state and throughout the country even. But just at the state level, we could say the fair tax or the land tax or whatever would be good for that. But at the federal level, right? I think if we had to make cuts to make the fair tax work, it's doable.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of I'll just use the military as an example because it's probably one of the largest chunks. We spend more on our military than the next 8 largest militaries in the world. So if you combine, China's military, Russia's military, Saudi Arabia's military, South Korea's military, Germany's military, the next 8, all of them together, they would still be spending less than we do.
Right.
So,
and it's unfortunate, but carry on.
No, just going to say, a lot of people don't realize that. If I was running for something and one of my campaign issues was, I think we should spend twice as much on our military as, the next largest military. I would probably get a lot of conservatives that'd be like, yeah, we should spend that much without even realizing that we're currently spending way much more. I mean, personally, I think spending twice as much as the next largest military, probably we would be fine. We don't need to spend as much as the next 8 combined.
Because the issue with the military is that they've been blindly, at least in my view, is that they've been blind. They've had their blindfolders on, and we've come up with this perception that somehow the president of the United States can order them around and order them to bomb other countries, and they just blindly follow these orders, and their generals just reinforce them, and there's no real accountability on the part of Congress to rein a lot of that in and to bring forth the camaraderie between Congress and the military. But yet when it comes to the funding, the Congress just says, Congress says, okay, here's another $4 million and here's more power that we're going to give you if your name is someone like President Donald Trump, and now we end up with Joe Biden. So I guess, what is, and I feel like the Constitution differs and is hardly ever enforced, but what's your take on it?
Okay, well, I think you're right. It does rest with the main issue, rests with Congress. And it's a real thorny political issue because whenever someone says that they want to cut military spending, it's always spun as, oh, I want to pay our soldiers less. Okay? And that's obviously not really the point. The reason that we spend so much on our military is not because we pay our soldiers, $1 million. Any veteran can tell you that. It's all the other things that go into it. And for example, I used to work for the world's largest arms dealer. In case you're wondering what that is, that would be Lockheed Martin. When I first got out of college, that was my first job. I was an engineer for Lockheed Martin, working on military projects. And eventually I just decided I wanted to do something differently, and I went back to school and became a teacher. But it really showed me that, it's a jobs program. Every congressman wants to have some of that money in their district. So really, no one in Congress is incentivized to talk about cutting it, okay? Because that would mean eventually it would come back and affect their constituency, their district. So I don't know a way out of this conundrum. Ideally, we just need more people like Justin Amash that stand on principle. But
so, do you think going into the next election cycle, we could maybe begin the process for that?
So the next election cycle will be next year, 2022. That's the next time federal offices are up for election. And one, I'd say, kind of ray of hope that I've seen this past election was the Frontier Project that the Libertarian Party kind of spearheaded. And it focused on winnable races. And we actually got someone elected to Wyoming State Legislature. First time a Libertarian state rep was elected in several decades. And another one just lost by a couple dozen votes. So we almost had two. So I think if we build on that, and instead of, say, throwing money at 100 different House of Representative races, if we can find, 2 or 3 that are actually winnable and focus more of our funding that way, I do think us electing someone to Congress is not out of the question. Will it be hard? Definitely. Is it a sure thing? No. But I do think it's possible now.
But the gist of the funding should be focused on winnable races. So if you happen to be in a race, for example, that's not winnable, you can still run on behalf of the Libertarian Party, but you may not get as much funding from the party as, let's say, some race that's winnable. Because the idea is to build up that infrastructure, correct?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I'll use myself as an example. I ran unopposed, simply because no one wants to be part of the Johnstown Water Board because we're not paid. We're the only city officials that are strictly voluntary. But for that kind of race, I didn't need lots of money. It was, and there are other races out there like this, like school boards. You don't need a large campaign for those generally. City council or town council spots, or zoning boards, things that people don't really think of when they think of political offices. So for people that know that they're not going to get lots of funding, that's certainly one route to go. If they want to run for a higher office, they'll have to fundraise more of that money themselves. So if someone wanted to run for, state assembly or state senate or House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate, and it was a race that was kind of a long shot, they would still, yes, definitely run. But like you said, they would have to raise more of that money themselves, rather than trying to get some large donors from the national level.
But the idea for the party would make more sense to focus on winnable races, and it doesn't necessarily exclude candidates that are running, just that they're going to have to come up with the money themselves if that's, and that's part of, the risks that one has to take if they're considering running for office. But as you mentioned, local elections can help build that foundation.
Yeah, like this last election, well, not this last one, the one a year ago, where I was on the ballot, it was Republican straight across the line, and then there was me as Libertarian. So in the whole city of Johnstown, it was that were running. I think there was one ward councilman for one of the wards that actually had more than one candidate, but pretty much everything that was citywide, just one candidate. So just getting that out there so people can see, like, oh wow, there's a Libertarian, and things aren't going to Mad Max levels, just trying to normalize it. Because people hear and see the stereotypes of libertarians far more than they actually meet actual libertarians.
Yeah, because part of the issue is the media and how to get around that, and get enough people to say, hey, this is a viable option. And because we are the third largest political party in the nation, if I'm correct on this matter, that would mean a direct threat to the Democratic and Republican parties who actually own the mainstream media or who are working together to try to delegitimize the LP itself.
Yes, and you were correct. We are definitely the largest. We're the third largest party in the country. In fact, we are larger than the Green Party, the Green Party, the Constitution Party, and the Working Families Party, and the Reform Party. All of them combined, we are still about twice all of those combined. Most people don't realize that not every state allows people to register into parties. It's only about 31 or 32 of them. But in those 31 and 32, that's where we can see how many numbers the different national parties have. And we're, I think, over 700,000 actual registered libertarians in just those 30 states. And in some states, we're actually getting multiple percentages. So, for example, in Nebraska, we're actually at like 1.6% of all voters. And once we reach kind of a tipping point, we'll be that block of voters that really could swing one way or the other, depending on the candidate, depending on the issues. But when it comes to the media, I'm going to bring up Larry Sharp again. In kind of his talking about his run for governor after the fact, he mentioned that, some things kind of opened his eyes, like when asking media people, why aren't you covering me? Just being told, flat out, well, you didn't buy any ads. So basically the media, as everyone can probably already guess, it's pay to play. So this is one of those areas where, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to change media overnight. So that means that we're going to actually have to fundraise and be able to buy those ads. So I know it sucks hearing that, you have to pay to play. It's just the current political reality.
Right.
And
the
only way you're going to get your name in a poll is if you actually pay to have a poll yourself.
Correct. But the thing of it is, when it comes down to it, the national media, right, whether it be Fox News or One America News, or whether it be like television and radio outlets like CNN, MSNBC, NBC, Newsmax, whatever it happens to be, right, whenever you get a name recognizable person running, in this case, Justin Amash, who temporarily ran for the Libertarian nomination for presidency, was ridiculed And the typical response was that you're going to decipher the votes from the Democrats and the Republicans are going to win from the Republican side. And then from the Democratic side, it was you're going to decipher the votes from the Democrats and the Republicans are going to win. Even without him in the race, how do you counteract that type of message? And, because most people, while it's good that 60% in the Gallup poll support third parties, we don't often see that come to fruition. And do you think a large part of that would be because of the messaging?
I don't necessarily think it's the messaging. And you mentioned, how the media covers, people with some name recognition. But just want to point out that this last presidential election, Kanye West was running. And even with all of his millions of dollars and his ubiquitous name recognition, he got less than 0.1% of the vote. So I just want to reiterate that, having a big name person isn't a sure thing of getting coverage.
Right. But at the same time, the media, when Justin Amash temporarily was running for the Libertarian nomination before dropping out, the wasted party vote, like, what are ways that we could counter that message in hopes of, bringing on more support for the party?
Well, I think, and I know this is hard to do, but appeal to their long-term goals. So, even in races where we don't really stand a large chance to win, if you want say you're a Democrat and you want the Democratic Party to actually care about peace, okay? If they notice that a lot of their voters are starting to vote Libertarian, one of two things are going to happen. One, eventually they're going to be so small that we will win. Or two, they're going to actually try to copy a little bit of our messaging to try to get those voters back. So either way, in the long term, by voting Libertarian, they're going to get what they want. Okay, they're either going to get someone that cares about peace from the Libertarian Party, or they're going to force the Democratic Party to start running candidates that care about peace. And same thing with the Republican Party. If you want smaller government and lower taxes, and the Republican Party obviously does not care about that because every Republican president has increased spending, billions and billions and billions of dollars. Actually, sorry, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. So if enough Republicans start voting Libertarian, one or two things. The Republican Party will actually have to start running candidates that are serious about shrinking government and lowering taxes and spending, or they're going to diminish to the point where we actually can win. So I think the biggest thing holding us back from that is the constant barrage of this is the biggest election, ever. 2000 was the biggest election, most important election ever. 2004, it was the most important election ever. 2008, and so on. Every 4 years, you get this same mantra of this is the most important election. You can't vote third party this time because this is the most important one. And that's something that both the Democrats and Republicans put out to basically hold their voters hostage, to make sure that they don't, vote for, a different team.
Mm-hmm. And yet it is their right to vote for whichever party they want. So I just want to switch gears now. Besides the what we can do to increase our chances and so forth, there's also many people that'll say, but the Libertarian Party supports abortion. And my argument to that is The Libertarian Party is actually rather neutral on the matter, just that we support the actual platform, if you read it, supports individuals making these decisions for themselves. But coming from a pro-life perspective, I think it's a matter of evaluating the issue. And let's say I'm pro-life, because obviously, right, pro-life libertarians
Yeah.
exist, right? And the idea is that we are against abortion, or the idea of allowing women to abort their offspring, if you will. And then there's the pro-choice faction of the Libertarian Party, which would argue that it is their right to make such a decision, even if that decision results in the child being killed in the womb of the baby. I mean, in the mother, if you will. So this is a contentious issue on both sides. But one argument that's come out is that if we outright ban abortions and we outlaw it altogether, my concern with that is that would increase the number of abortions that occur and may even result in abortions going in through the black market, which may even come to a worser outcome. So if that argument is true, how would you respond to it, and would you make the same argument with that?
Well, I'm not 100% pro-life or pro-choice personally. Well, one thing is, I have a friend who I've known since childhood, and she was born prematurely at 6 months. And this was back in 1982. And she survived and is now a completely healthy adult. She actually teaches at Bard College. So I have a hard time being okay with someone that has a baby that is 6 or 7 months getting an elective abortion. Obviously, if the mother's life is in danger, that's a different thing. I'm kind of, well, there's a political idea which states that, a woman has a right to her body. So they have a right to choose how to use their own body, whether they want to have an abortion or not, and so on. But as soon as the baby leaves the womb, okay, that now becomes a separate individual. And actually, down in Virginia, their latest abortion law, it allows abortions up through the third trimester, only in cases of women's lives being in danger, or their health being in danger. But if they do, if the baby is viable, doctors are required to give it care, so actually take care of it. And I actually think that's a good balance. Ideally, what I would love to see is if the research in artificial wombs progresses, because they are actually working on that. They actually were able to gestate a lamb for a couple months, I think, in one of the latest prototypes. So I understand the arguments on both sides, and I think that would be the only, if you would even call it a compromise, that would at least partially satisfy both sides. I don't think you're ever going to completely satisfy both sides, because it's a very emotional, and rightly so, issue for a lot of people. But as you said, with everything that is on the black market is more dangerous. So back when, cocaine was sold in the in the pharmacy, there were, people sold overdose, but there were fewer because you knew what you were getting. Same thing with heroin. If someone was taking opiates in the form of pills, okay, generally they know exactly how much is in that pill. If they switch to heroin, though, the potency of it varies dramatically. And now with fentanyl, So whenever you make something black market, you're inherently making it more dangerous.
Mm-hmm. So the other part of the argument too is that if you outlaw the abortion issue, whether it's at the federal level or at the state level, whichever level of government it's at, that could cause the issue to increase and potentially more dangerous, as it would end up in the black market. Wouldn't that be a correct assessment, or would it be an incorrect?
Yeah, that's kind of what
assessment?
I was trying to go for, saying that, when you push something to the black market, it's invariably going to be more dangerous. So back when abortions were illegal, women, it's not like women didn't get abortions. The people that really wanted abortions still got them from, maybe not trained medical professionals, and maybe not in the best sterile conditions, with health support there if needed. And a lot of women died because of that. So yes, I do think that would be a perfectly correct assessment, that, by making abortion illegal, you would actually end up creating more problems.
So it's better to just say instead, all right, we're going to address it differently. We're not going to outlaw it, but instead what we're going to do is make it way easier for women to be able to adopt and their, offspring or whoever they give birth to, and, reduce the regulation and taxes that go into like the adoption agency, which would be the best alternative for those who are pro-life like myself, addressing the issue as a whole, rather than, okay, we got this temporary fix, we're gonna outlaw, and that's that. Because that's what the Catholic Church, even, and many other religions and political establishments would argue, and then they would make the claim that if you're libertarian, it's kind of incompatible. So how do you address that?
Okay. Well, you mentioned adoption, and that is certainly one key aspect of this. A lot of people think that, if you want to adopt a baby, you just fill out some forms and it's a pretty simple process, but it sometimes takes years. And the last numbers that I saw, these were from a few years ago, was that the average adoption costs around $40,000. So what that means is only the really well off are able to adopt children. And another reason why you see so many people going to different countries to be able to adopt children. So I do think that needs to be streamlined, addressed, and be made more available. But also contraception. There is absolutely zero reason why am I blanking on this? Why the pill for women is prescription. Okay, there is no reason why that cannot be over the counter. Okay, so it inherently is going to go down in price, because no one spends a fortune on Tylenol or Advil, because they're over the counter. They face competition. So I think having contraceptives be more readily available will help as well. Now, for those that say that it's an all or nothing thing, and I do think that in the Libertarian Party, there is definitely space for people that are absolutely 100% pro-life and people that are absolutely 100% pro-choice. So I would disagree with someone saying, if you're in the Libertarian Party, you obviously don't believe this when it comes to abortion. Because it's one of those philosophical issues of, when does a person become their own person? That is going to be debated for forever.
Right. And it's kind of helpful to get, because I look at it this way, right? If you got let's say you got 100,050,000. Let's say the number is 2 million women, right? And out of that number, right, you're able to convince, let's say, 100,050,000 of them, or however many you're able to convince, to not have an abortion if they're all pregnant, right? In this scenario, that would mean that you saved that many babies from getting aborted versus taking the government approach to the matter.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. Having, it could be advocacy groups, it could be adoption agencies, it could be just different charities, trying to reach out, trying to prevent people wanting an abortion. That's really the only way you're going to reduce abortions, is you reduce the number of people that actually want one. Because a government ban won't work.
Right. And, you know, some people would argue that it would. And some institutions, like the Catholic Church, for example, where their researchers are saying that the abortions were banned in Chile, and this is according to what they're specifying, that the abortion rate in that country went down. But if it went down, it could mean that it was the result of them making adoptions more affordable and adding incentives for it. And that way, there's no real way to gauge in that situation. But overall, we know prohibition isn't going to fully address the matter on itself, and probably won't work even in any regard.
Yeah, I do think that there are a lot of different variables that have to be taken into account. You mentioned Chile. One number I would love to see alongside their abortion numbers is how many women died during pregnancy. Because I think that would kind of show, okay, how many women tried to get an abortion illegally and died because of it. But yeah, there are always going to be a lot of different issues when it comes to abortion. Because again, if you have fewer people wanting them, okay, that's usually because of a lot of different factors. Could be contraceptives, could be having more sex education, it could be having more pathways for adoption and more support for people that want to do that. So I don't have a silver bullet that would cure it overnight. I think we have to look at a lot of different options.
And these are better alternatives to the issue.
Yes.
So the conclusion to that whole issue is it's better to focus on adoptions and contraception and reducing the regulations involved in adoptions and so forth. And that would be the conclusion, is that instead of outlawing the matter, what we mentioned are the best alternatives to address the issue head on, and to know that the issue is not going to fully go away, but we can work on reducing the numbers.
And actually, kind of the reverse of this situation is surrogacy, which in New York is currently illegal. If you're a couple that is having trouble conceiving or having multiple miscarriages, and you want to pay someone to be a surrogate, carry your child, you pay all the medical expenses and so on, that's currently illegal in New York State. You're not allowed to do that.
And that would increase the rate of the abortions in that matter.
Well, I bring it up in terms of the adoption issue. Parents that want children, there are very few avenues that you can take once you reach a certain level of say, medical intervention. So I just thought I'd throw that out there because I know a lot of people probably don't realize that in New York State, being a paid surrogate is illegal.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate, and I never really knew that myself, but these are the type of laws that we should work on getting rid of.
Yes.
And it's hard when you either have a Republican majority or a Democratic majority, and in any given case, you have no libertarians in the state legislature.
Yeah.
But we're working on
Yep.
that. And so the other thing is gun rights. And I think you posted an article. It was through Reason, and I forget who wrote it. But what's your take on that?
Sure. Yeah, I posted an article recently about some of the gun control, say, bills that are going to try to get pushed through, at least in the House. Some of them would be a ban on large magazines, very similar to what we have already here in New York State with the SAFE Act, where they banned all magazines that would carry more than 7 bullets, and eventually I had to go back and change that. But it would ban firearm ownership for anyone that had sought out certain mental health assistance, and it would continue the current war on drugs issue, where if you're a marijuana user, even if it's legal in your state, even if you're on medical marijuana, it's currently illegal for you to own a gun. So if you're a cancer patient and you need medical marijuana, you have to choose between your medical needs and your right for self-defense, which I just think is unconscionable. So when it comes to gun rights, I am 100% pro Second Amendment. And it's not because I have a background in it, okay? And actually kind of the opposite. Growing up, I did not own any guns. My family didn't own any guns. We weren't hunters. We didn't go out sport shooting. The closest thing we had growing up was my brother had a BB gun. So it's not like I grew up in this culture of guns. And the way I came to my current position, actually, it was over a few years, and it has to do with a number and a little short story. So the number is 262 million. So just keep that in mind. So I mentioned that I became a teacher earlier, and the first place I taught was up in Saranac Lake. It's a very small community. The way I describe it is picture the middle of nowhere, and it's a little bit north of that. It's up in the Adirondack Mountains, very isolated communities. And I'm a technology teacher with just shop and engineering. And one of the projects that I decided to do was making ornaments. And I wanted to make sure I was inclusive as possible. So I said, you know, it could be for Christmas, could be for Hanukkah, could be for Thanksgiving, could be for Tuesday, could be for your birthday, it could be an ornament for literally anything. And I had a student come up to me after class, and he looked scared. And I asked him, you know, what's going on? And he asked, like, you know, would he get in trouble if he decided to do a crescent moon and star for his ornament? And I said, oh, well, for those of you listening that aren't aware, that is one of the symbols in Islam. So I said, of course, you know, that's perfectly fine. But the look that he gave me, it was off. It wasn't, you know, a student trying to ask for a favor. It was fear. And I ended up asking around to other teachers, and I found out about their family. and they were Muslims. They were Bosniak Muslims. And again, for those that don't know, in the 1990s, there was a civil war involving Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kosovo, Serbia. And during that time, there was the Bosniak genocide, where they would literally round up all males over the age of 14 and shoot them. So their family actually emigrated to the U.S., fleeing that. So knowing that kind of background really made me understand why he had that kind of primal fear, and it got me into looking into it further and more research. And one of the only reasons why the Bosniak genocide was relatively small, if you can call tens of thousands small, it was because they didn't confiscate their weapons well enough, and it became a civil war. And if I have the option of choosing between a genocide and a civil war, I'll take the civil war any day. That number,
Same here.
262 million, that is the number of people that were killed by their own governments during the 20th century. So this doesn't count any wars, even civil wars. Okay, it only counts when their government was actually the one killing their own citizens. That's how many people died. More than died in war, orders of magnitude larger than the number of people killed by actual individuals, murder. Because everyone knows about the Holocaust, and they should. It is a horrible stain on, human history. But it wasn't entirely out of place in our history. Whether you want to look at the Ukrainian forced starvation of the USSR, the Great Leap Forward with China's Mao that starved 50 million people. History, even recently, the Rohingya in Myanmar are facing ethnic cleansing, and the Uyghur population in China, okay, they're routed up into forced re-education camps. So the Second Amendment, it is about self-protection. Don't get me wrong. It has absolutely 100% nothing to do with hunting. But at its core, it's a insurance policy on the government. It's a security policy where if things get bad enough, the populace has enough resources to fight against things like that happening here.
And at the basic level, the right to self-defense.
Yes. If I was a sheriff in one of these counties, in New York State, the sheriff kind of has to sign off on any pistol permits. And sometimes it takes months, like 6 months to get one. And I can't imagine being like, if say a woman came in, just left a abusive relationship and wanted a handgun for self-protection. I can't imagine being a sheriff that says, no, you can't have one, or maybe in a few months, and then seeing her turn up dead a few weeks later because she didn't have anything to protect herself with. Those are the people that this is for. It's for people that are vulnerable. It's for people that are facing violence, whether that be, from one person to another, like self-defense, or whether it be, God forbid, the government against the people. And that's what made me so Second Amendment that I am now, because I want, at the base of it, I want fewer people dying. I want fewer people being killed. And I mean, the numbers don't lie. Having guns, yes, it means that there are going to be some bad people. And unfortunately, it's impossible to prevent 100% of those bad people.
But you can curb that with the right to self-defense. So if any bad person comes around you to try to target you, you can target them back, basically, in self-defense.
And it actually even helps the people that don't own guns. A couple years ago, one of the downstate newspapers got a hold of the database of all registered gun owners in New York State, and they actually published a map where people could actually see, which addresses had permits for guns. And I thought that was completely reckless, because one, if someone's looking to steal a gun, you've just made all of those people targets. But on the flip side, if someone just wants to break into a house and burglarize it, it made everyone else that doesn't have a permit for a handgun targets. So the not knowing is part of the effectiveness of the Second Amendment. If I went out in the street and I tried to mug someone, I don't know, whether they have a gun on them or not. Now, in New York State, most likely they don't, because it's very hard to get a concealed carry permit in New York State. Pretty much you have to be like law enforcement or know someone in law enforcement, if you know what I mean, to get that kind of permit. If I was in another state, I'll use Texas because that's always the example that people use. I would face a much higher risk of someone having a gun if I went out and just tried to mug random people on the street. So I think what you said is 100% true.
Right. And see, and I believe it. Like, we have the Second Amendment primarily for self-defense. But, and then we have this thing called, I don't know if it's in the U.S. Constitution or if it was embedded in the Declaration of Independence, and whether that's really embedded in the U.S. Constitution or not. But one of our founders, and I believe it was a legal opinion, no less, stated that we should have the Second Amendment for the purpose that if the government becomes tyranny, we have the right to abolish that government and replace it with a government that is for the people. And do you believe that, the whole Capitol riot in D.C. had anything to do with that? And then what's your take on that?
Well, I'll just start off by saying what I think happened at the Capitol was completely wrong. We currently still have a system in place, a legal system in place. The kind of tactics of storming and political violence, that's a last resort, not a first resort. There were ample opportunities for Trump's, I'll use the term legal team loosely, to present evidence in court. And every single time they refuse to present evidence in court, because if you actually lie in court, there are consequences. If you lie to the media, there are none.
Mm-hmm.
So they whip these people up with these false claims that even they knew were false, because they knew that if they actually said them out loud in court, they could actually face disbarment. And these people thought that we had reached that level of tyranny, and that's sad. I obviously did not vote for Biden. I didn't vote for Trump either, but I recognize that, yes, he did win the Electoral College. One of the one of the beauties of our voting system is its disorganization. Okay, there is not a federal tally of votes. It is based by state, and then inside the state, it's based on locality. So if anyone wants to do huge voter fraud, they would have to have a conspiracy of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people together to be able to pull that off, because everything is so localized. Now, is voting fraud, does it happen? Almost assuredly, yes. But it's usually done at the local level. So if you want to challenge, an election of, say, a mayor in a small town, go ahead. If there was voter fraud, it's going to be pretty easy to see. But when it comes to national races, I don't see it impacting it. Unless, of course, you can get those tens or hundreds of thousands of people on board with a criminal conspiracy without anyone talking.
And that would take years to come about. But the bottom line is, a lot of the conservatives and the people on the right who supported Trump stormed the Capitol because of the concept of the voting machines, that we don't even know how many states or localities use them, where there's effectively no paper trail. But I would make the argument that at least here in New York, we do have paper trails with the paper ballots. They're just put in the machines, and so that to make a digital copy of it. And we do have both methods, but they still have to be counted or whatnot, and it varies in different states. So I believe that what you're talking about is correct. The issue then is, it would be a matter of proving whether the amount of voting fraud is evident. And if there's not a shred of evidence because of the system and you weren't able to find the evidence, then it makes the issue irrelevant.
Well, you mentioned the companies that put out the different voting machines, and they're currently suing Giuliani, Trump, a few of his other legal team members for, I think it was like $1.7 billion for a defamation. And, if there was widespread voter fraud, they wouldn't be going down that route of trying to sue Trump and Giuliani, because, if they do this, it's going to end up a day in court where they have to show, yes, it was fraud, or no, it wasn't. And if they're willing to do this, my bet is on there wasn't. But you said here in New York State, yes, we do have a paper trail, and that actually came into play recently in the 22nd Congressional District, which is actually just a little bit west of where we are. Claudia Tenney and her Democrat opponent, and there was actually also a Libertarian in the race. It was a three-way race. And the Republican and Democratic candidate, they were separated by just a couple dozen votes. And there were so many, counts and recounts that the election was in November. They just posted the results of that election last week. It took that long back and forth to go through every single paper ballot that they had and made sure that they got it correct. So I do think that it is prudent to have a paper trail, because then you can actually prove to people, like, nope, this is it, So I do think that's one thing that New York State does correct.
Right, but many states don't. But if you're running a national race, that's kind of hard to prove when you gotta. Then you figure the electoral college, you get so many people, and they only pick the people in the party whose state won those votes. You'll have a pool of electoral college delegates, or whatever they're called, electors. And so you'll have them for the Libertarian Party, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Constitution Party, and for any eligible political party on the ballot. And, if the Democrats, let's say, win New York, then they pick the pool of electors within the Democratic Party who they know is going to vote for that candidate. And what I found absurd with the whole thing was that at the time, during the Trump administration, he was trying to say that in Georgia and in other states where that may or may not have the paper trail, I can't pinpoint exactly, but it just seems like there was fraud and this and that is I think is kind of like, wow, if you can't present evidence in court, yet you're going to tell the media about this. I think there's a portion of it that was show. I mean,
no, I agree. If there was evidence of voter fraud, present it in court, then it would be laid out. It would be part of the record. And then people could actually examine it for themselves and come to their own conclusions. And they chose not to do that. Another thing that some states do, Maine and Nebraska, I think it's Nebraska, yeah. They actually elect their electors by congressional district. So in this past election, both Maine and Nebraska have 2 or 3 House districts among them. And in both of them, they were split. 1 or 2 went for Biden and 1 or 2 went for Trump. So you can even make it even more localized than the state level. So if you want an elector from that congressional district, you would have to just win that one congressional district. So there wouldn't be this winner take all mentality where, if you get 51% of the vote in New York State, you get 100% of their electors.
Right. And so the Electoral College is based on the different protocols of the different state governments for the presidential race, if I'm not mistaken. But you do nonetheless have vote winner take alls. And one of them, I think, is also Texas.
Almost all states.
And there's a lot. Right. Almost all states. But that also includes New York and Texas. And so I just, but you do have 1 or 2 states where the electors are elected in, the congressional districts or maybe in local districts. But this whole phenomenon with Ted Cruz and the Republican Party many of whom voted against the certification of the Electoral College even after the Capitol riots occurred. And how do you confront that, especially when you have conspiracy theories for every little thing that was pro-Trump under the Trump administration by people like Alex Jones and Roger Stone?
So I think one of the most overrated qualities in a politician is loyalty, because that's really what drove those people voting the way they did. They didn't believe that there was widespread voter fraud, but they felt loyalty to their party and to Trump, and maybe a little bit of fear. And one of the attributes that I think is most lacking in politicians is shame. These people, they feel no shame. They see themselves as doing, what was right because our party is right. And that's very, very, very dangerous. I think you have to believe in the system if you're going to be part of the system. So if you're going to run for Congress, you have to see Congress as a legitimate body that follows legitimate rules. And I think just basically they were trying to hijack the election, and unfortunately there's no repercussions unless they're voted out next time they're up for re-election.
Which in some states is very difficult. When you look at Ted Cruz's odds, he's got a good chance of getting reelected unless, he has a meltdown or something that Republicans in that state will say, which is very difficult given that their rapport with him. Although I do think it's possible because prior to Ted Cruz, there was Kay Bailey Hutchison, and she was getting elected in that Senate district over and over and over again by the Republicans until Ted Cruz came aboard. But what Ted Cruz did was he primaried her and won. But because he had the support, and this was under the Ron Paul, Tea Party thing. But Ted Cruz since then has fomented himself as the next Kay Bailey Hutchison.
Well, actually, I wasn't aware of that, but thanks for kind of educating me. I didn't realize that that's how he became senator.
Right, because he primaried Kay Bailey Hutchison in the Republican Party, and I believe that was under the 2012 Ron Paul presidential nomination. But the Republican Party does a lot of shady business. And Gary Johnson even predicted that they weren't even going to let Ron Paul win. And they had the whole thing set up so that Mitt Romney would win the nomination no matter what. So it didn't matter that Ron Paul had all the delegates. They found a way to get Romney to win the nomination. And but I think in Ted Cruz's case, he legitimately won the nomination in the party, but this was during that time.
Okay. How late were you thinking of going with this?
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, I just wanted to bring that up, but do you have any final thoughts before we end the podcast? What's your conclusion to all this?
I would just say that everyone's path to liberty is going to be different. We need people, from my background, there is absolutely no way that I, quote unquote, fit the libertarian stereotype. But I ended up finding my way here. So I think we need more people with more different life experiences. And even if they aren't 100% libertarian when they come here, they need to be welcomed, and different policies need to be discussed, because that's the only way people are ever going to change their minds or grow or come to different conclusions than what they have been kind of brought up with.
Right. And I agree with you on that. All right, Brandon. So I want to thank you for joining me on this podcast, and I really appreciate you doing this with me. So this is Brandon Lyon, and he's the chairman of the Fulton County Libertarian Party, and for our viewers, if they want to contact you about, if they live in the county and they want to get a hold of you for whatever reason, do you feel comfortable providing the contact information?
Sure. Probably the fastest way is through Facebook. We have a Facebook page. We have a Facebook group. Or you can also email me at fultonlp@gmail.com. And I'll get the email that way. But yeah, we're always looking for people to become more involved, and we welcome everyone to the party that wants to be here.
All right. Well, thank you, Brandon, for joining us, and I truly appreciate it. All right. Thank you,
Bye.
Brandon.